Hi, my name is Betsy Pool, and I'm the narrator of the film you're about to see. I was also the lead researcher who assembled the teachings of Falco Tarassaco as delivered over 40 years of this core mythology of humanity that I believe represents global consciousness. There are a few things I would like you to know about this film. First, this is part one of a three-part series. Part 2 and Part 3 will actually bring us into the present and to a point in the future that's quite critical for humanity. My partner and I have actually shot, assembled, and put this film together out of pocket. In order to complete Part 2 and Part 3, we need to seek the support of people who find this project of resonance. We've created a Patreon campaign, and you're able to support us with a small or even larger monthly donation, which will allow us to finish Part 2 and Part 3 and bring these to you as soon as possible. So if you could please click like below and also follow the link to the Patreon campaign. Further, we're crowdsourcing the subtitling in other languages of the film. So if you're fluent in English and also in another language and would be interested in actually assisting us with crowdsourced subtitles, we would be deeply appreciative. So sit back, and I hope that you will enjoy and find informative the film that you're about to see, the story of everything.
A story, not rational, magical, like the world you live in. It begins with an inspiration.
And when my mother died, I had the strongest intuition that we were supposed to in some way end up in Italy.
A calling.
And it was as if there was an external voice that was shouting at me, go Google Italy, underground temple, time research. And then I started to see people here that I recognized.
And a long journey to a new life on the other side of the world.
This work is taking place in this sacred valley.
A new kind of civilization, a dream. A channeled message revives the mission, introduces an ally, and help from the beyond, who bring new knowledge, love. It's more than we remember. It guides the mission to bring a new story to the planet. A vast esoteric archive once reserved, now opens. It fills a ruin with story.
This is the space. In our dream of creating the incubator, this becomes the space that we come together to work in.
It's not a story for story's sake. It is really a story with embedded call to action in it.
It was an amazing project. It was an extraordinary effort. What you created with those storyboards blew me away.
And calls to a group soul.
I think this is a group soul that's a group of storytellers.
You are one of these cards. You just need to, within yourself, come to how you feel that you would be comfortable with expressing that. But I think it's critical.
For at least 5,000 years, storytellers across the planet have mythologized the gods, great peoples, nations, cultures, their origins, and ongoing battles. Now, a lost mythology reawakens to unite this mosaic of individual stories into a singular narrative, the story of everything. Welcome to the StoryRoom. This channel is going to bring to you a story of humanity that represents global consciousness. This is a story that I discovered after moving to a place called the Federation of Damanhur. Damanhur is the world's second oldest, second largest spiritual eco-community. And my family and I, in 2009, became the first American family to settle in Damanhur. We moved here from the United States. In 2011, I began a project with this community that was a communication project to understand how we can better communicate this core ethos of this community to the world. And in the process of that project, what I found here was this incredible mythology that's at the absolute foundation of this community. This is a mythology that was brought to us by the spiritual founder of this community, a man by the name of Alberto Arauti, who in Damanhurian game took the name Falco Tarassaco. So Falco, as the founder of this community, was not your average man. He was really an avatar who had brought to us a knowledge that has previously not been as available. I would say it's esoteric as opposed to exoteric and available for everyone. And so in the process of this communication project, what I found there in the Esoteric archive was this extraordinary story of humanity. Now, for many, this will appear to be science fiction. But at the base of this community, this is really the core myth that has given rise to a community that the United Nations has called a model for the future of humanity. And so I want to bring this to you. I want to share this with you. And you may find this far outside of your worldview. And if so, just take this as a good story, science fiction. And for others who may find this more accessible, maybe this will give you a foundation to begin to look at a lot of the archaeological and anomalous objects that are starting to be found on the planet. And it may give you a sense that the story of humanity is much larger than we've previously thought it to be. So without further ado, I want to invite into this story room, before we begin our presentation, two elements. The first is fire, and the second is water. And these are two elements that will support us in our storytelling. So we're going to pass over here, and first of all, this is a lighter that we've used over the course of presenting this story many, many times. And so essentially, it's containing the intelligence of all of the fire that's been present as this story has been told. So now we're going to invite into the room the intelligence of fire. I'm just greeting the fire. And then we're also going to invite into the room the presence of water. Another element that has the ability to contain information. And I greet the water. So now we're going to move into this story. So for those of you who find this too far and broad, think of this as a science fiction story, like Star Wars or other popular culture. So I'm going to start initially with a brief lesson in what we in our community of Damanhur call esoteric physics. So this is a line of thought, a school of thought. And the first thing that I'm going to do is introduce you to our perception of how this world of form that we spend our daily lives in was created. So to do this, we're going to go back to something that we call, from our school of thought, the real. And in terms of modern day physics, the real would be the cosmic plenum where all information exists. So this is information in its purest form. And within that cosmic plenum, or the real, as we call it in Damanhur, we have both absolute laws, so laws that are running with an absolute pure nature, and also absolute intelligences. And within this cosmic plenum, all of this information exists. And these two elements of these laws and these absolute intelligences are going to give us the seed to the story that we're about to tell. So within this cosmic plenum, there are what we call primeval laws. And we look at, in our school of thought, universes as being formed when these absolute primeval laws come into contact with each other. So when they come into contact with each other, they're each fundamentally changed. And it's in that constellation of changes, when a series of laws meet, that we look at the creation of universes. So today we're going to be talking about what we call the universe of form. So here we are in this very solid reality, a solid reality which is 99.9999999% nothingness. This universe of form, from the perspective of our school of thought, was created by the intersection of these 8 laws. And we're going to go through them very, very briefly. If you are interested in finding out more about these laws, you can access a book on esoteric physics that's offered by our community. And we'll provide a link in the box below. But the first of these laws that we're going to speak about is the law of synchronicity. So the law of synchronicity, in its original form, was a general reservoir of events. And when it intersected the other laws and was fundamentally changed, it took on the function of being a selection of events. The second law is the soul atom. So this is soul as in singular, not soul as in S-O-U-L, or the anima of our beings. So this soul atom, in its original form, has the potential to create universes, which is exactly what we're speaking about right now. And in its derivative form, after it was changed by its intersection with the other laws, it begins to define the symmetry of forms. You'll see this next law is offset, because this law is going to become a very important law in terms of the ongoing story that we're going to share. And this is the law of divinity. So the law of divinity is going back up here to this absolute intelligence, this unique essence, which is one of many unique essences or absolute intelligences that are flowing through the cosmic plenum. So this divinity, and not to be confused with what we might in our common life think of as our gods from a religious standpoint, but really thinking about this as an absolute intelligence. So in its original form, it's this unique essence, and in its changed form, it's the law that allows this primeval divinity or this absolute intelligence to actually enter the world of form, to play this game world that we're about to share with you. So the next law that we're going to speak about is geometric essence. So the geometric essence in its original form was in fact order without form. And in its derivative or changed form, it maps out and defines the space-time territory that each form will occupy. So in order to better understand this, I want to share with you this concept that we speak about in our school of thought as rhythm numbers. So looking at and thinking of the universe as a constellation of numerological values, a rhythm number would be the address that every form, whether it's myself, the table, the chair, the wall, the camera, each of these elements would have a rhythm number. And a rhythm number, in fact, defines the place in time, the place in space, the length of time that object will exist. So all of the details about what that element is would be defined in its rhythm number. And if we go back to the concept of the soul atom, we can think about this metaphorically as this single atom that's moving at the speed beyond comprehension, tracing each of these rhythm numbers to bring all of this form into being. So now we're going to move into the next law, which is the time matrix. And the time matrix, actually in its original form, is simply a preservative and directional element. And in its changed form, it actually maintains the equilibrium between form, between mass and energy. The next law is the fall of neutral events. And the fall of neutral events is simply undirected events when it's in the cosmic plenum. And when it meets the other laws, it's changed into events that are directed towards an end in this story that we're telling. The next law is the law of chaos. And chaos, in its original form, is a mix of dimensions without substance. And in its changed or derivative form, it is in fact a stew of events that do not yet have a direction, a condition in which events are expressed beyond the view of divine attention. The last law in the formation of our world of form is the law of complexity. And the law of complexity is a law that in its original form allows us to enter this world of form. And in its derivative form, it's the law that gives the direction of the eventual exit of this world of form. So these are fairly complex concepts, but I want to give you these concepts as a base for how we are defining this universe of form. And now we're going to speak about what happened after this world of form was created. So first of all, we have to consider the fact that these laws intersected and created this world of form. And this world of form had an overriding objective: just to be, just to exist, not to evolve, not to become more complex, just to be. But remember, in our concept of the real, we also have these absolute intelligences. And via this law of divinity, these absolute intelligences have the opportunity to enter any new universe that's being formed and to play in that game world, to play in that universe in order to become more complex, more evolved, to gain added value, essentially producing more information to take back into the real when they finish this round of the game. So we're speaking about these absolute intelligences, and from our school of thought, we identify the fact that there have been previously 3 other primeval divinities or absolute intelligences that have entered and played this world of form. And these 3 other primeval divinities have the characteristic of this concept of what we would call angels connected to them. So these would be entities or beings that are connected to these previous primeval divinities, but in this new world of form would have no free will or no agency. So we're going to now be speaking about this 4th primeval divinity. And this is the primeval divinity that's going to enter the world of form. And we identify this primeval divinity or absolute intelligence as the primeval divinity of humankind. So when I speak of humankind in this broader story, I'm not just speaking about Homo sapiens. I'm speaking about all of the evolved life force throughout the universe. So this primeval divinity entered the world of form and essentially fragmented into all matter. So all matter, we call this in our school of thought the myth of the mirror. And in this fragmentation into all matter, everything was divinized. And so now you have this absolute intelligence that's entered this world of form with the objective of playing this world of form in order to gain added value, to produce more information, to take back into the cosmic plenum, when it's finished its tour of this game world. We also know that there will be in the future a 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th, and 9th primeval divinity that will enter this world of form to play this game world. We're going to now speak about this original duality that's set up. When this primeval divinity enters the world of form, remember our world of form has an overlighting objective just to be, just to remain in stasis. It's an entropic impulse. And so this world of form, when it's entered by this absolute intelligence, which has a different overlighting objective, so now the overlighting objective of this absolute intelligence is to evolve, is to become more complex, to gain that added value. So you have this original duality set up. And as time progresses, there are forms that evolve and become more complex and begin to enter into the era of a golden age of humanity, where there are evolved beings that are living throughout the galaxy, each of them carrying a piece of this original primeval divinity, a piece of this project to play the game world of form and become more complex. When this primeval divinity entered the world of form and fragmented into everything, eventually it evolved, and it evolved into anthropomorphized beings that exist throughout the galaxy. So we're looking on a galactic level right now. We're actually not looking yet at the Earth. And the reason that we're not looking yet at the Earth is because during this period, the Earth is really in the far reaches of the galaxy, and it's not accessible to the inhabited part of the galaxy. So the inhabited part of the galaxy, from our story, consisted of 5 star empires. These are represented by these orange cards. And these star empires are each a political, a social, a cultural concept in diverse parts of the galaxy. So each of them might represent any number of diverse non-terrestrial beings or alien forms. But each of them is still carrying this spark of this primeval divinity, this divinity that we call the soul force of humanity. And so these 5 star empires that exist are in addition to what we know of as time empires. So when we speak about time empires, we need to look at how we consider time in this school of Damanhurian thought. So we, of course, don't look at time as a linear structure. We look at time as a territory, a vast territory or kingdom, a territory like the animal kingdom or the plant kingdom. But in this territory, we have creatures that are time creatures. So we might look at the human and see that we are, in our biology, a time creature. Our physical being actually has filters that cause us to move through time in a linear nature. But our consciousness is not a time creature. Our consciousness has the ability to travel throughout this vast territory of time, which we do in our imagination, we do in our dream world. It's not constrained by the same construct of this world of form. And so in this time territory, there are many diverse paths. And as we continue our story, we'll be speaking about these diverse paths or planes of existence in time. In the beginning of our story, the Earth is too far afield, too far in the far reaches of the galaxy to be of importance to these star empires which are in the inhabited and developed part of the galaxy. And yet, the Earth is a very important celestial body. It is a world full of water, of life, and diversity. And it is situated in a central zone with regard to two galactic empires. The Earth is an important celestial body because it has a critical number of what we in our school of thought call synchronic lines. Synchronic lines are not meridians or ley lines as we normally think about the map and how our planet is segmented. The synchronic lines, as you'll see from the photo, are snaking, swirling channels of energy. So they can dip below the ground, they can rise above the ground, but these are the channels of energy on which thought travels, our dreams travel. We incarnate and disincarnate on synchronic lines. So they're really the channels of energy that are able to carry life force. And because this planet had such a critical number of synchronic lines, it had a very advanced capacity to host a diversity of life. And that makes this planet of great interest once it becomes accessible to the 5 star empires. So about 2 million years ago, a series of stargates are opening on a galactic level. And these stargates, which are discovered by the 5 star empires, now bring the Earth into the vicinity of these 5 star empires. Diverse star passageways open at different times in different galactic regions, giving access to racially and culturally diverse colonizing populations. These stellar passageways that make the Earth accessible to other territories of the galaxy have limited temporal or time duration of a few thousand years. This is based on the rotation of the galaxy, which takes around 20,000 years. And when these stargates are discovered, there's a desire to colonize the Earth. And so there's a colonization agreement that is created between the 5 star empires. And essentially this colonization agreement basically says whoever can keep the most warm bodies on that planet over the course of the opening and closing of the stargates, which is not happening on a dependable or rhythmic level. But the deal is whoever can keep the most warm bodies on the planet will in turn have political control of the Earth. Here begins the story of 2 very different histories that will cross paths on this planet. There is human life that evolves on this planet, and also other forms of humanity that arrive on Earth from other worlds. "2 million years ago, at a time in which our native Earth ancestors have not yet developed great potential, advanced civilizations from other worlds begin to arrive on Earth. Their primary objective is to mine and exploit the natural resources of Earth in order to make this planet commercially and politically important within the galaxy. This colonization agreement which is created, which says that who keeps the most colonizers on the planet between the undependable opening and closing of the stargates will politically control the planet, leads to this colonization of almost 2 million colonizers who are dropped on planet Earth. So this is a time where these colonizers are not the best and brightest. They don't have a critical amount of technological knowledge. This is, in fact, a very brutal time on this planet. This is a time of war between the star empires who are fighting to gain control of this planet. There is massive celestial and galactic change happening. The planets are moving in very diverse ways than we see today. The instability of the sun in this epoch creates great climactic upheavals. The planet experiences 4 catastrophic ice ages and 3 catastrophic global warmings. Had there been a constant, continuous link with the central zones of the star empires, there would have been ways to contain these disasters. But these Earth colonies are too peripheral and isolated when the stargates close. And these Earth empires that are created rise and fall very rapidly. Star passages reopen, but only briefly. New waves of colonizers arrive, but in a few dozen years, 4/5 of the inhabitants of the Earth are wiped out by epidemics. 2 million years of galactic expansion on Earth is canceled because most of the population die of disease. So we're going to leave the Earth and we're going to travel back into the galaxy. On a galactic level, we're going to go back in time a bit to this golden age of humanity, when this anthropomorphized beings had evolved into forms that were really highly spiritually evolved. And we speak about this as a golden age of humanity, humanity as divinities. And when we say divinity, what we're speaking about are entities that are carrying a bigger part of this original absolute intelligence's desire when entering the world of form. So now these beings are in expansion throughout the galaxy. And this is a DNA-based expansion. And they're coming into contact with diverse encounters with different entities. At the same time, this primeval divinity, which entered the world of form, evolved into anthropomorphized beings that represented its original objective. Also, the world of form was divinized and had beings that evolved out of its overlighting objective. So remember, the primeval divinity has the desire to evolve, to change, to become more complex, to gain added value. These forces of entropy have the opposite desire. They have an entropic desire, a desire not to evolve, not to change. They're not creative. They simply want to be and return this world of form to its original state. Now these beings that are carrying the original objective of that absolute intelligence come into contact with beings that are carrying this overlighting objective of entropy. And this is in fact a DNA-based exchange. And in this DNA-based exchange, this soul force of humanity is in fact contaminated by these forces of entropy. We speak of these forces of entropy in our story world as the opponent or the enemy. So not an enemy in the conventional sense, but in fact a series of beings who are carrying the objective that's opposed to this evolutionary process of the absolute intelligence that's entered the world of form. So in this DNA space exchange where there's contamination by this anti-life force, there are a few who escape this contamination. And these are beings that are even more highly evolved and are carrying a bigger piece of that original divinization. And these beings who've escaped the contamination now carry on the role of maintaining the original objective of that absolute intelligence or primeval divinity who's in the world of form. Over the course of time, this external enemy, which is now also an internal aspect in the beings, there are a series of battles that ensue. And these are battles on a galactic level. But remember, there are also battles happening on the Earth. This entropic force is not only galactically inside the beings that are on a galactic level, it's also inside the beings who are now inhabiting the Earth. The star passages reopen. A change in galactic law establishes that the right to claim a world and its resources requires settlement by only a few thousand colonizers. But the colony must exist for at least a few thousand years and demonstrate an adequate level of technology. It becomes important for star empires to recognize and link to any vestiges of their past colonies and few survivors. in order to establish a record of a star empire's longevity on planet Earth. This is the time of the settlement of early, not historic, Atlantis, which we'll speak about later in our presentation. This is the time of Mu and the formation of these societies. In 10,000 years, the colonizers of Mu create 7 Earth empires. These 7 empires of Mu are colonized by 7 different races of people who come from the stars, each with diverse cultures. They establish a large territory of many islands, a rich area with long-term fixed energetic links to their star empire of origin. The peoples of Mu enjoy long lives. Over the course of 9 to 15 days, almost 55 million to 60 million inhabitants were wiped out. Massive volcanic eruptions and meteorites aimed by alien forces who are opposed to spiritually advanced civilizations developing on Earth decimate Mu. Many survivors, unable to cope with the aftermath, take their own lives. The end of Mu is sudden. Mu lacks the technology to guide souls through programmed incarnation, which would have allowed them to repopulate their project on Earth. Alien forces, representing the forces of entropy, suppress spiritually advanced civilizations from developing on Earth. But the Star Masters see Earth as a potential reawakening ground for the soul force of humanity and the original objectives of the primeval divinity, incarnation, and also time technology will soon be conquered in historic Atlantis. This series of battles ensues, and at a certain point, there's actually victory over the forces of entropy. And this victory leads to this question for this soul force of humanity. What do they do with this defeated opponent? One of the core aspects in the ethos of the soul force of humanity is that diversity is of value. And so what do they do with this defeated opponent? Can they just eliminate it completely? What are the ramifications of eliminating it completely? Is it leading to evolution at a higher rate? And so a decision is made on a galactic level to confine these opposing forces in the far reaches of the galaxy. So essentially they're exiled into the far reaches of the galaxy. And for a period of time, peace reigns on a galactic level. But remember, this contamination has already happened. So the core aspect of humanity already now has an element of entropy as part of its composition. But the enemy on an external level has been confined into the far reaches of the galaxy, and peace reigns throughout the galaxy. The battleships are disassembled and in museums throughout the galaxy. We'll speak about what's happening with that force of entropy that's been exiled and confined to the far reaches of the galaxy. If you want to read more about this time of peace on a galactic level, there's a book in Damanhur called Amskasat, which speaks about this period in a very evocative way. Because we are definitely here in the world of Pan. And this story room actually exists in a rustico, or an old ruin, where it's been assembled. And all around us, we have the sound of roosters, of chickens, of dogs, of tractors. So please excuse any sound that may not quite reflect the material that we're working on, when in fact, it does reflect because we are in this very, very real world of form. Energy lines that have the bell ringing in them. So we spoke about this series of battles and defeats of
Stop. It's too loud.
What are those? Chickens? I missed this from the last. Shut up! We spoke about the defeat of the forces of entropy and the important decision that the victors had about what to do with this oppositional force. And the decision has been made to confine them to the far reaches of the galaxy. And so the enemy is in the far reaches of the galaxy, where essentially it's forgotten in the evolved part of the galaxy. But the enemy, though forgotten, does not forget. And so the enemy, in its exile, reamassed force and came back in a mass attack against the soul forces of humanity with millions and millions of beings who were in attack against their former victors. So what we understand from our research is that during this period of attack, there were in fact 4 epic battles that happened. And with each of these epic battles, the soul force of humanity suffered a massive defeat. And this series of defeats is still resonating all the way over in our current time. Because at the end of each of these epic battles, with the defeat of humanity, there was a détente that was negotiated, an accord. So the victor imposed certain statutes on the soul force of humanity that had lost these battles. And with each of these battles, humanity on a galactic level lost senses and had extracted from the consciousness archetypes. So when we speak about this loss of senses, we typically identify humanity as we know humanity as having 5 senses. But we also know that we have a whole series of what is known as junk DNA. That junk DNA represents also the senses that were turned off at the end of each of these battles, to the point that after 4 of these détentes, humanity is left lobotomized with only a fraction of the potential that it had prior to these assaults. We know in our school of thought that there are at least 20 fundamental archetypes that have been lost, and many archetypes that have become corrupted. One important archetype that's become corrupted is the archetype of collectivity. Humans are meant to be living in association with one another. And yet, because of this impacted archetype, we tend to pursue an individualistic life rather than a communal or community life. This is one of the archetypes that in our community we're working to revive. These massive defeats also, you'll recall we spoke about this concept of synchronic lines. These massive defeats left the earth also crippled, with the synchronic lines closed on the earth. So now the inhabitants of the earth are incarnating in a closed cycle, where previously those incarnations might have taken us to other parts of the galaxy, other societies. Now the beings on the earth are incarnating in a closed cycle. I want to speak a bit about these epic battles. I have a friend here in this community whose name is Anaconda, and he often works with people under hypnosis and has probably regressed more people in Italy than any other hypnotherapist. And he also worked with another member of our community who had a very long-term collaboration with him. So he actually accessed the beings that she was channeling and asked where their collaboration had originally begun. And they said to him, Paolo, which is his anagraphic name in Damanhur, are you sure you want to see this? And he said, yes. And he found himself mentally flashed back into the period of these great battles. So these were battles that were not just happening on a physical level, they were battles that were happening on a psychic, on a magical, and on an interdimensional level. These are battles like nothing we can imagine at this point in our history. On a galactic level, at this point, after these battles, a new galactic order is formed. What's extremely significant about this time period, a series of stargates were opening and closing and creating a series of colonizations of the Earth. And at this point, the reopening of the synchronic lines links the Earth to all of the other planets in the galaxy that host life, becoming a travel passage to other worlds. The Earth was brought into proximity of the developed portion of the galaxy. By this time, the first star empire has become the ruling star empire of the planet Earth. And now this brings the Earth into dependable proximity to that evolved and settled part of the galaxy. And at this point, after three massive battles that have happened in the preceding eras and epochs, the first star empire of the 5 star empires has gained political control of the Earth. Throughout the openings and closings of the star passages, the first star empire has been represented on Earth by the colony of Atlantis. The evolution of Atlantis has been difficult. The colony has been nearly completely obliterated 3 times. This chart marks the time spans of the Atlantean colonies. Now we come into a time in which Atlantis has anchored itself with global colonies and created an energy grid around the planet, which we are still activating today. Most importantly, Atlantis has conquered the technology for the programmation of birth, as well as time technology, which will lead to it becoming the capital of a great time empire. At this time, the resurfacing of the synchronic lines supersedes the use of the star passageways and brings the Earth into permanent proximity to the first star empire. A massive investment is made in the Earth. So now there are colonizers that are put on the Earth who are the creme de la creme. They are technologically knowledgeable, and we start to see the beginning of the development of historic Atlantis. So historic Atlantis was a civilization that had a high level of interaction with what we call the Star Masters. So you'll remember earlier in our story, during the DNA-based galactic exchange, there were a series of highly evolved beings who were carrying a bigger portion of the original intelligence's intention in the world to form, who escaped the contamination by the forces of entropy. Now these Star Masters are still carrying the original project of that absolute intelligence, and they make a massive investment now in the Earth. There are 88 representatives from the diverse galactic races who are sent here. This is a period where Horus is a galactic divinity. A divinity on this level meaning a being who's carrying a bigger piece of that original divinization of matter. So Horus is also sent to this planet during this time period. A huge investment is made in Earth. Again, we must recall that humanity has within it still this aspect of entropy from the original contamination. Atlantis is the capital of both the Galactic Empire, and it's also a colony of the first star empire, as we said, and it's also a capital of a time empire. Again, the time empire being an empire that's not just taking up geographical space, but also chronological space. To understand the scope of Atlantis, it's necessary to explore the concept of time empires. Civilizations who have developed the use of time technology gain the ability to move part of their civilization to areas of the time territory that, if considered from a linear perspective, would appear to be in the distant past. For example, in this map, which from a chronological perspective is 2 million years ago, has overlaid colonies from 2 different time empires that have been established there from advanced civilizations in the future. These insertions do not have a temporal continuity in the way that we understand history. These maps, A, B, and C, represent ancient Earth civilizations that were established from civilizations from the future. Atlantis had the technology to transport part of its population to areas of Earth where there was past climatic stability, closed star passages, and no war or conflict, starting with 1.5 million years prior to its modern settlement in historic Atlantis. For eras of usually no more than 200 or 300 years, stable conditions are created with human groups who arrive from a much more distant future. The first rule of every time colony is to stay in absolute isolation from any peoples native to that time. It is dangerous to have contact with people who might be the forebearers to the civilization you have come from in the future. There was a project that was established called the Vine Project. In Italian, we also call this the Tappe, T-A-P-P-I, meaning the corks. So the Vine, this word Vine is a word in sacred language. So these entities were beings who were carrying an original program around maintaining the mission of the original intelligence that entered the world to form. And this group of beings come together 22,000 years ago in Atlantis, and they make an agreement to continue this project of the original absolute intelligence at another point in the timeline. The duration of historic Atlantis is about 19,000 years. There's a golden age taking place, and that's about 24,000 years ago. Then in the context of this, there's another strike back that humanity engages in with the opposing forces. And again, humanity is defeated by the forces of entropy. And this is a massive defeat in which the divinity itself lost a fragment of its memory. So humanity is now missing a piece of its overall memory. And in this aftermath of this defeat, the corruption of Atlantis accelerates. So the beings who were in Atlantis were carrying this spark of entropy, and now after this strike back and defeat, the downfall of Atlantis begins. Now, during this downfall and this corruption of Atlantis, the spiritual masters who were carrying the core knowledge, which previously had been what we would call exoteric, as opposed to esoteric. So exoteric meaning spiritual knowledge available to all. Esoteric knowledge meaning spiritual knowledge reserved for a few. And at this point, these spiritual masters begin to pull in the spiritual knowledge and to leave Atlantis. And as they're leaving Atlantis, the spiritual aspects that are present on a day-to-day basis, and I use the example of, for example, the music of the spheres playing in the streets. Now, as these spiritual precepts are lost because the spiritual masters are exiting Atlantis, Atlantis is developing these aspects technologically. So as the spiritual IQ is lowering, the technological IQ is raising. And these spiritual masters, as they're leaving Atlantis, are being hunted down by the ruling class of Atlantis and murdered. And spiritual knowledge is being lost. But those who survive actually move into the creation of underground societies. And this is the period of the formation of underground societies, such as Agartha and Shambhala. These societies underground are formed to be protecting areas for the spiritual knowledge. And they're formed at points on the synchronic lines where there can continue to be a galactic communication going on. These spiritual masters who are living at points on the synchronic line, it seems highly likely that the demise of Atlantis was in fact engineered or called in because it had become so corrupt. And so we know that at a certain point, about 11,585 years ago, the destruction of Atlantis is seeded by three massive events. The first of which is an asteroid that was likely purposefully aimed at this planet. So there's a massive impact event that happens. In addition, the supervolcano of Santorini, not the historic eruption that we know about, but a previous eruption that's not part of the archaeological record. And we'll explain why it's not part of the archaeological or fossil record in just a moment. But this supervolcano of Santorini erupts, and these two events cause massive flooding across planet Earth. And as you know, almost every core mythology of every peoples on the planet, whether biblical or other, speaks about this massive flood. So this massive flood created the eventual complete destruction of Atlantis. You may ask me, why do we not have more physical evidence of this incredibly developed society that existed? And the reason we don't is because these three massive geological events created a tear in the space-time continuum. So now there exists a massive chasm in time, which means that all of the timelines from 11,585 years to the past are disconnected from the timelines 11,585 years to the present. What this means is information can't travel across this chasm in time. If we were to eliminate this fracture in time, the fossil record would represent all of this story that we've learned prior to this moment. But with this massive event that creates this fracture in the timelines, very, very little information can make it across that chasm and come into the present. This is why we hear whispers of Atlantis from Herodotus, from Plato. They're whispers of this previous society, but there's no or very little physical evidence. And as physical evidence that doesn't carbon date on the existing archaeological timeline starts to come forward, what we can understand is that there is a bridge that's being created across this chasm. And we'll speak a bit later about what's actually creating this bridge. When this bridge is eventually, hopefully, fully densified, we'll begin to see more and more evidence of this previous story that we've been sharing. We're going to thank and collect the fire and the water. And first we'll salute the fire, and then we'll collect it. And we'll salute and thank the water. And now we'll bring our story to a close. Thank you for joining us.